Hello, everyone, and welcome to Confectionery Live 2024. My name is Clay Gordon. I'm the technical editor here at International Confectionery Magazine, and today I'm going to be talking about cocoa traceability and why traceability is hard. Right? And if you want to know more about this topic, my article in the September issue is on this topic. But I wanted to be able to talk through it in ways that are a little bit different than I am given the opportunity to do in an article. And so I want to begin today by talking about some key definitions. So if we're going to be talking about traceability, what do we mean when we use the word traceability? So what is a supply chain? Because what we're talking about is traceable supply chain. So a supply chain is the path by which a product makes its way from the point of origin through to its final destination. And when it comes to supply chain software tools, that normally means to the retailer, the point at which it gets sold to the customer, whether that customer is a consumer or whether that customer is a confectioner or a bakery or some other entity. In the case of a big confectioner, they might also have their supply chains. And so a supply chain might actually consist of a number of different supply chains, and different aspects of the supply chain have different technical requirements. Right? So when we say supply chain, that's what we mean, right? So what does traceability mean, right? And what does that entail? So traceability means that what we can do is we can follow the transactions between the entities, whether it's a cocoa farmer or it's an intermediary, whether it's a cocoa trader, whether it is a chocolate manufacturer, right? What we want to be able to do is we want to be able to link the transactions between each of these entities, and we're going to use a software tool which makes it possible for multiple entities to be able to look at the links, to look at the transactions. And so when we create a transaction in a supply chain record, right, what we're doing is we're saying, okay, who are the sellers, right? Or who is the seller and who is the buyer, right? What is being sold, right? How much of it is being sold? What is the price that we've agreed to, right? And if there is what the quantity is involved. So that is an individual transaction record. And what the traceability supply chain is doing is it's documenting a chain of custody, right? And that's where the supply chain link, we got chain of custody. It goes from the farm, right, to an intermediary, to perhaps somebody at the port who's responsible for putting it into a container, right? It gets transported from the port of export to the port of import. And then from the port of import, it goes through customs and then out the other side to whoever is going to be transforming the cocoa beans or whatever commodity it is that we're talking about, right? But the supply chain is actually just the record chain of custody. Any other information, right, can be considered to be metadata. So, for example, we may want to know more about the farmer. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create a record in some database somewhere that says, here's the farmer's name, here's the name of the farm, here's the location of the farm, right? Here's how big the farm is, what the area of the farm is, right? How many trees there are in the farm, what the types of trees there are that are on the farm. We might have other information about agronomic practices, which are specific to that farm. We might have a record of any special certification that this farmer might have, right? And all of that information should be considered to be metadata. It is data about the data that is in the chain of custody record that forms the supply chain, right? If we try to put all of that data into the basic supply chain of custody record, what we do is we create this very, very complicated and eventually very, very brittle, right? In the sense that if changes need to be made, it's easy to break the entire system. So we want to think about the chain of custody as the basis of the supply chain, right? And that information about what is in the chain of custody can be stored separately. And the purpose of this supply chain, traceability, right, is often so if I'm a manufacturer, for example, I may want to know where my cocoa is at any given time. I may require, and this is a big issue, so I may be required by the EUDR to be able to say, I know that my cocoa came from an area which was not deforested, right, since the cutoff date in 2020, I believe it is. Right? So there are reasons for this traceability. I need to be able to satisfy regulatory requirements. So in the EU, it might be the EUDR. There may be some issues associated with traceability when it comes to things like heavy metals contamination, being able to document where the cocoa comes from. Here in the United States, we have something called the Foreign Supplier Verification Program and the Food Safety Modernization Act that requires manufacturers to be able to say, I know where my ingredients come from, for example, right? And that is the primary purpose of a supply chain, to be able to let us know where stuff comes from through the hands through which it travels to the point at which it reaches my facility, and then eventually to the point of retail. What we need to be very, very careful about is being able to say, okay, traceability is about documenting the chain of custody, right? And what that means is and I'm going out of order when it comes to my presentation because that's the nature of live presentations, is that documentation of the chain of custody is driven by regulatory standard, as I mentioned. And there are, if you are a developer of supply chain traceability tools, or if you are a purchaser of supply chain traceability tools, there are two industry standards that you want to know about. You want to ask your development team or the company that you're purchasing or leasing the software from if they are compliant when it comes to two international standards. The first one is X12. So X12 is a consensus-based electronic data interchange standards, which are interoperable, which support the transfer information between trading partners in a supply chain. There are specific aspects of the X12 standard, right, which facilitate things like customs brokerage records. And so if your supply chain tool does not natively support the X12 standard, then you may find that there is extra work that needs to be done in order to be able to generate all of the required documentation to take your cargo from the port of export through customs at the port of export, through customs at the port of import. And so you want to make sure that whatever product you're working with supports the X12 standard. If it doesn't, right, and you're incorporating this into a much larger system, you need to make sure that you can get the data from your supply chain tool into whatever software. You might have a big enterprise resource planning platform that you're using internally. These two systems need to be what is called interoperable. The data needs to go back and forth between these two systems as easily as possible. The second standard that you want to be aware of is an ISO standard, and it's called 34101. And the ISO 34101 standard is about traceability and sustainability in the cocoa supply chain, right? And so if you have a supply chain software tool, right, you want in cocoa, you want to make sure that the data which is required for ISO 341 is implemented natively into that tool. Ideally, what you want to be able to do is just push a button and you can generate ISO 34101 compliance reports. Right? Again, if it's not built in natively, then you're going to have to go through extra hurdles in order to be able to generate these compliance reports. And these ISO 34101 supports could, in fact, be the background of EUDR compliance reporting. So there's a really, really interesting reason, really, really important reason to be aware of the ISO 34101 standard if you aren't. You can go to the ISO website, you can download the document. Unfortunately, it's not free, right? But if you're working with thousands of tons of cocoa, you should know about this document and have a physical copy, and that your IT team should know everything there is to know about implementing. Now, what's a challenge for me when it comes to ISO 34101 is that it's a traceability and a sustainability standard. And traceability and sustainability are not synonymous terms. So traceability supports reporting about sustainability. So having a single standard which conflates sustainability and traceability, right, is not something I would do if I were given the opportunity to go about and create a standard. They would be two separate standards, or sustainability would be a substandard and detailed very, very differently. But despite my reservation, right, if you're developing cocoa supply chain management tools, or you have an in-house development team that is developing those tools, you need to make sure that you are ISO 34101 compliant. You need to make sure that you are collecting, right, all of the data that are required, right, to be compliant, right, in order to be able to service your customers, the users of the software, in the best way possible. There are also two really, really important concepts here around data, right, that are important to keep in mind. The first one of which is there's a difference between data veracity and data integrity. So data veracity speaks to the truthfulness of the data. Can we trust the data? Your first and foremost requirement should make sure that any data that you enter into the system represents ground truth, right? It needs to be accurate. It needs to be complete as well, right? If your data are not complete and it's not accurate, even if you were to put it into a quote unquote blockchain tool, right? The blockchain tool will guarantee the integrity of bad data, right? Just as well as it guarantees the integrity of good data. So blockchain in and of itself is not the solution. It may be a part of a solution if what you want to do is you want to generate a record of transactions which cannot be forged after the fact. But you don't want to necessarily write an entire supply chain management tool in a blockchain tool, right? Conventional databases have got decades worth of development in terms of helping with the veracity component. And if you do make a mistake in the data, being able to edit the mistake in the data in a really, really important way. Right? So when we talk about traceability, this is what we're talking about. Traceability is the record of transactions from the point of origin through to the final seller of it, right? The goal is to support business decision making. For example, I want to know where my cocoa is. I want to know who I bought it from. I want to know how much I spent for it, right? I want to know that this supplier is one that I can trust. So these are all things about a traceability system, right? But traceability systems support reporting about sustainability, right? And then finally, traceability for this section, traceability and sustainability are not synonyms with transparency. Transparency is about how much of the data in the system you make available to people outside your company, right? And there are reasons why there aren't big shared platforms, is because you as a company may say, listen, I've got data in my system I don't want anybody else to see. It's proprietary. There's a competitive aspect of it I don't want to share. And these are legitimate reasons for not having an industry-wide shared system with accurate, up-to-date data in it, because hey, that's what I'm paying for cocoa exactly on a per farmer basis might not be something I want to reveal, because some purchaser might come in and buy that cocoa out from under me, which happens unfortunately in cocoa. So we do need to be very, very careful about that notion of transparency. Another aspect of transparency that people don't tend to think about is that not only are we filtering the amount of data, which data and how much of it we let through to the outside world, but we tend to put interpretations on top of the data. So, the actual table of what I bought and how much I spent and who I paid, right, is actually a very, very small table, right? But what I may want to say here, it is as a part of much larger corporate efforts, right, to guarantee that there's no illegal labor in the supply chain. Here's what I'm, physically doing on the ground to make sure that we are EUDR compliant and things like that. So it's important to distinguish between traceability, sustainability, and transparency. They are not the same things. So why is traceability in cocoa so hard? And this is the point, right? And that is the first mile problem. Cocoa unlike, for example, soybean production, is very, very highly distributed. There are literally hundreds of thousands of smallholder farmers in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana alone, right? And if you want to be able to start keeping track of the cocoa, tracing it from its origin, you need to go all the way back to the farmer, right? And start collecting it at the farm gate. And maybe you want to start getting data before the cocoa reaches the farm gate. Right? And you can't assume that every farmer has a smartphone. You can't assume that every farmer has an always on data connection. You can't assume that the farmer is saying, well, I want to do things the way my grandfather did, and my grandfather is doing things the way his grandfather did. And if you're asking me to change things, there's a whole lot of social stuff that's going on in there. It's not just the technology involved. It is human resources. It is the human relation aspect. You need to deal with the socioeconomic stuff that's going on in order to be able to convince a farmer to change the way they're doing things for perhaps generations on that family farm, right? So conquering what is called the first mile problem is, in fact, the biggest challenge when it comes to traceability. Tracing the cocoa from the port of export to the port of import to your factory, that's easy. Tracing the cocoa from the farm gate through the first buyer, right, through a myriad different ways that the cocoa can go from point A to point B in a producing country, that is the problem that needs to be solved. And whatever it is that you do needs to be capable of very low technology approaches, very high technology approaches. The data structures need to be incredibly flexible, and there needs to be accommodation for doing things lots of different ways within the same system. And that's why traceability, especially in software, is incredibly difficult. But that last point, conquering the first mile, is a driver for innovation, especially given the volatility of the price of cocoa in the last year, right? Can we use, or are we going to use, software systems for traceability to entrench the status quo, right? Or are there ways that we can think of, oh, could we use the traceability system as a driver for improving the consistency of fermentation? Can we use the traceability system as a driver for methods to combat smuggling, for example? So, is cocoa grown in one country, go to another country, right? So because of a price difference, is there a way to use a traceability system to make that more difficult? More importantly, is that once we have the data in the system, can we create new kinds of markets and new kinds of contracts? Can we use the system to enable buyers and sellers to signal to each other about what they have to sell and what they want to buy, right, based on something other than a grading standard or defects, which is the way most of the cocoa in the world is traded today? And then finally, might we be able to cater to the underserved markets? So 80% of the cocoa in the world is considered to be commodity in bulk. And then we have this 20% of the cocoa, which is considered maybe specialty or fine flavor. And from the ICO perspective, the difference between fine flavor cocoa and conventional cocoa is conventional cocoa will only produce cocoa flavor, whereas fine flavor will produce fruit and flour and nuts and all these other special flavors that we like in the cocoa. But there is this 20% of the market that may not be sold onto the exchanges. And so could we use a traceability solution which improves the quality of fermentation, which combats smuggling, right, which has ways for buyers and sellers to signal to each other, right? Could we use the opportunity for a traceability system to drive innovation in cocoa markets, which might be able to diffuse some of the underlying challenges, right, associated with the drivers for volatility over the past year? And that's where I'm going to leave it off today. I mean, hopefully, what I've done is I put a lot of stuff out there. You've got a lot of questions, and I'll be here to answer the questions afterwards. And of course, if you connect to me through the magazine, be happy to follow up on these as well. And I hope all of you are enjoying every single one of these sessions here at Confectionery Live 2024. Until the next time, everybody, right? If you're working with chocolate and you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong.